Many factors affect a character's background. Two of the most important are his race and his character class. In a sense, a character class is his profession. Some characters are fighters, some mages, some clerics, and so on. A character's race affects which character classes are available to him. Only humans are allowed to have unlimited class options. All non-human races are limited to some extent. There are two reasons for this. First, the restrictions are intended to channel players into careers that make sense for the various races. Dwarves are, to a certain extent, anti-magical and incapable of shaping magical energy. They can't be a wizard. Halflings, despite their ties to nature, lack the devotion and physical will to become druids. Similar situations exist for other demi-human races. Secondly, the demi-human races have advantages that are not available to humans. Flexibility, the ability to choose from among all the classes, is one of the very few human advantages. This excerpt is out of chapter 2 out of the second edition Dungeon Master's Guide. We are talking about Dungeons and Dragons and how the race is being removed for the species.
What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other word would smell as sweet.
As Wizards of the Coast and D&D evolves, it brings forward light from Shakespearean lore of the way he used words to express himself and to express his works and to express his stories. And it makes me think of what is a rose by any other name. It's the quote from Romeo and Juliet, Act 2, Scene 2. It's one of these situations where Wizards of the Coast continues to try and change the wording of their game in efforts to appease certain groups and certain people, and it just falls flat. You change the names of stuff, but it doesn't change anything. It doesn't change the fact that these names are there. The whole idea of race in general has nothing to do with racism. It has nothing to do with that at all. I've spoken at length of this in the past, where Wizards of the Coast and a subsect of the internet sits there and believes orcs are bad people, or they're equated to a certain gender or a certain race out there in the world, and that is not the case. It's a different species, although humanoid. Back at the days of the makings of Dungeons and Dragons back in the 70s, when you looked at the Writers Guild and the unions and the people that controlled the media that we saw back then, one of the reasons why Star Wars went its own way, why Lucas left the Writers Guild, why he left it in the first place, was because there was a written rule that any human being or any human species that was going to be depicted in fantasy or on the big screen and stuff like that had to still be humanoid. And where if you look at Star Wars, not necessarily all of them look humanoid. They tend to change the species and change them outright to a much more alien type of place to be. But if you look at Gene Roddenberry with Star Trek, they all relatively stayed humanoid. That's the big difference, and that's where a lot of this came from, and why things in a fantasy game were depicted the way they are. Today, Wizards of the Coast hires a cultural reader of their stories, and they're going through every inch of the game to change the narrative. Well, of course, we've got to turn to Kotaku, out of all places, for this news. Dungeons and Dragons ditches race, wants to use species instead. So let's change it up. Let's change the wording. Let's change the name of what we call the different races of the game. If you're an elf, you're now a species. If you're a dwarf, you're a different species of a demi-human race from the original game. Does this change anything? Does this really do anything other than sit there and say how virtuous we are from Wizards of the Coast? Does it ram that virtue down the throats of gamers alike? Does this really matter? A lot of people say, oh, whatever, you can deal with it. It's not a big deal. Some people go, oh, 6th edition's going to be great. D&D 1. As they sit there and try and sell you each and every tidbit and make you buy a subscription for the new versions of Dungeons and Dragons. Were they ever updating and changing the rules to fit the modernized era of today's standards? It's absolutely ridiculous to even be talking about this. If you got the old books in your basement, if you've got the old books, or if you find the old books at a garage sale, pick them up, because these are some of the greatest things ever written when it comes to role-playing and fantasy and all these other things. There is so much context in there that why does it matter that Wizards of the Coast has to turn around and churn out new versions of these books every couple years to try and update it for whoever wants to have this update? I can tell you right now, they're not doing well in the front of Dungeons and Dragons. They're taking aim at like the original SR or whatever they call it. They're taking aim at people that are just putting out their own adventures, trying to be creative in this game. And for what? For what? What does this really do? Does this actually do anything for us? Does this changing of the narrative and changing the name, does it really change it at all? No, it doesn't change anything to do with the books. It just makes them sit on a pillar and think that they're propping up one side of the aisle over the next. It's absolutely ridiculous to even be talking about this. Earlier today, Wizards of the Coast made an announcement that a lot of people have been waiting for a long time for Dungeons and Dragons. It's going to stop using the word race. Racism defeated.
You can't defeat me.
No, I know. But he can.
When it comes to the racism being defeated and all this other thing with changing race to species, it's kind of weird in that sense. It's always been listed as race, as a demi-human race for D&D, and it's always been a fantasy genre, and the fantasy genre keeps it separate from reality. Reality doesn't show the same thing as when you have a fantasy thing. Is it wrong? I'm not entirely sure where to really lie at this point, because why change it? It doesn't make sense having to go through the texts of the past and change them for the future, because the writing of the stories have suffered dearly. Write a good story, people will come back again and again. People know the fantasy realm and the fantasy games are just that. They're fantasy. They want a reason to defeat the damn villains in the game. And if you take away the certain languages and the certain tones and the certain storytelling aspects of fantasy, you're not going to be left with a villain. You're not going to be left with a hero. You're going to be left with a blank page where you have to write your own story from here on forward without a rule set that was placed in front of us. And that's all it is a rule set. Rules can be bent or broken. So honestly, for Wizards of the Coast to be spending this much time on changing race to species, I think it's a waste of time. I don't think it does anything more than virtue signal out to the world, out to the masses, that they're trying to do better for things that they've done in the past. I don't know. Where do you guys lie? This is where I'm at on it. I'm your Proud Canadian Phoenix Cinder Shadow signing off here. Don't forget to like and subscribe and leave me a comment down below on this one.